Welcome to Quiz Time. I'm your quiz master, Sean, and I've got questions for you. 100 of them to be precise. And they're all about 1950s music. So let's see what we remember, give our brains a workout, and have a little fun. Shall we? Let's begin. Which French singer gained fame in the 1950s with her hit song La Vie en Rose? Juliette Greco, Muriel Mathieu, or Edith Piaf? And that was Edith Piaf. What was the title of the first Eurovision Song Contest winning song in 1956? Volare, Refrain, or Ne partez pas sans moi? And the winner was Refrain. Which British rock and roll artist became popular in the late 1950s with hits like Move It? Was it Cliff Richard, Lonnie Donegan, or Billy Fury? And that British rock and roll artist was Cliff Richard. Which Italian composer wrote the famous movie soundtrack for La Strada in 1954? Nino Rota, Ennio Morricone, or Pietro Mascagni? And it was Nino Rota. What genre, characterized by its use of acoustic guitar and accordion, was dominant in 1950s Paris? Jazz, chanson, or opera? Chanson. Which German singer-songwriter became known for hits like Capri Fisher during the 1950s? Lael Anderson, Caterina Valente, or Freddie Quinn? And it was Freddie Quinn. What style of music, influenced by American jazz, became a popular movement in Scandinavia in the 1950s? Swing jazz, bop jazz, or Dixieland? And that would be bop jazz. Who was a Danish jazz violinist that rose to fame during the 1950s? Jesper Thielo, Svend Asmussen, or Niels Henning Ørsted Petersen? And that was Svend Asmussen. What was the title of the 1959 Eurovision winning song by Dutch artist Teddy Scholten? Een Beetje, De Vogels van Holland, or Net als Touwen? And that would be Een Beetje. Which Irish traditional folk group gained prominence in the 1950s? Irish traditional folk group. And that group was the Clancy Brothers. What was the name of the popular 1950s British skiffle band led by Lonnie Donegan? The 50s British skiffle band was the Lonnie Donegan Band. Which Greek singer gained fame for her rendition of Never on Sunday in the late 1950s? Nana Mouskouri, Maria Callas, or Melina Mercouri? And that was Melina Mercouri. Which composer created the score for the 1958 French film Elevator to the Gallows? Miles Davis, Michel Legrand, or Georges Delerue? And that was Miles Davis. Which style of Spanish music gained international popularity in the 1950s? Bolero, zarzuela, or flamenco? Spanish music that gained popularity in the 1950s. Flamenco. Which popular Dutch artist was known for the hit song Tulips from Amsterdam? Andre van Duin, Max Bygraves, or Wim Sonneveld? And the Dutch artist was Max Bygraves. What instrument was closely associated with the 1950s folk revival in Scotland? The acoustic guitar, bagpipes, or was it the fiddle? And that was the acoustic guitar. Which Austrian-born conductor became famous for leading the Vienna Philharmonic in the 1950s? Herbert von Karajan, Leonard Bernstein, or Wilhelm Furtwängler? And that was Herbert von Karajan. Which French artist popularized jazz accordion music in the 1950s? Richard Galliano, Django Reinhardt, or Gus Viseur? The jazz accordion, Gus Viseur. What was the title of the hit song by British artist Alma Cogan in 1955? And Alma Cogan had a hit called Dreamboat. Which Italian opera singer was referred to as the voice of the century in the 1950s? Luciano Pavarotti, Maria Callas, or Enrico Caruso? The voice of the century, Maria Callas. Which Portuguese music genre, characterized by melancholic tunes, rose in popularity in the 1950s? Fado, flamenco, or tango? Portuguese music genre, that would be fado. What famous British composer premiered War Requiem in the 1950s? And War Requiem was composed by Benjamin Britten. Which famous 1950s Belgian jazz musician was known for his work with the vibraphone? Fat Sadi, Toots Thielemans, or Bobby Jasper? And that was Fats Sadi. Which Hungarian composer was posthumously recognized in the 1950s for his modernist works? Zoltán Kodály, Béla Bartók, or Georgi Ligeti? And it was Béla Bartók. Which style of Polish music was revitalized in the 1950s? The waltz, the mazurka, or the polonaise? The revitalized Polish music was the polonaise. Which Swiss composer was known for his symphonic works in the 1950s? The Swiss composer Arthur Honegger. Which Spanish conductor achieved worldwide fame with his interpretations of Manuel de Falla's works? Pablo Casals, Enrique Jorda, or Ataulfo Argenta? And that would be Ataulfo Argenta. What was the name of the famous British orchestra founded in the 1950s? The Philharmonic Orchestra, the BBC Concert Orchestra, or the London Symphony Orchestra? Founded in the 1950s, that would be the Philharmonic Orchestra. Which style of French dance music gained prominence in the 1950s? Tango, can-can, or bal musette? French dance, bal Musette. Which Danish artist gained fame for jazz vocals during the 1950s? Danish artist. Jazz vocals. And the answer would be Inga Bork. Which composer was known for his Mediterranean-style symphonies during the 1950s in France? Olivier Messiaen, Jacques Ibert, or Darius Milhaud? And that would be Jacques Ibert. Who was a British singer nicknamed The Force's Sweetheart, still performing in the 1950s? Shirley Bassey, Vera Lynn, or Alma Cogan? The Force's Sweetheart, Vera Lynn. What popular instrument was used in French chanson music in the 1950s? The violin, the harmonica, or the accordion? And chanson was played on the accordion. What British genre combined American rock with folk in the 1950s? Britpop, skiffle, or rockabilly? And that genre was skiffle. Which Italian-American singer had a major influence on European jazz in the 1950s? Frank Sinatra, Luis Prima, or Dean Martin? And that would be Luis Prima. Which Dutch orchestra conductor gained fame for interpreting classical works during the 1950s? Bernard Haitink, Willem Mengelberg, or Jaap van Zweden? It was Bernard Haitink. Which Spanish zarzuela composer continued to write operettas into the 1950s? Federico Moreno Torroba, Isaac Albeniz, or Manuel de Falla? It was Federico Moreno Torroba. Which Scandinavian country became a hub for European jazz in the 1950s? Norway, Denmark, or Sweden? The hub of jazz in Scandinavia was Sweden. Which German opera by Karl Orff premiered in the 1950s? Antigone, Carmina Burana, or Der Mond? The German opera by Karl Orff was Der Mond. What was a key feature of the French pop music scene in the 1950s? Romantic ballads, heavy percussion, or minimalist lyrics? A key feature of French pop music in the 50s. Romantic ballads. Who was a popular figure in Belgian jazz during the 1950s, known for playing harmonica? Toots Thielemans, Django Reinhardt, or Gus Vizier? And that would be Toots Thielemans. Which style of vocal performance characterized Austrian folk music in the 1950s? Austrian folk music. Austrian yodeling. What iconic piece did French composer Olivier Messiaen premiere in the 1950s? Quartet for the End of Time, Toranglia Symphony, or L'Ascension? And that would be Toranglia Symphony. Which artist helped revive Irish traditional music in the 1950s? Irish traditional music was revived by, and that would be Sean O'Riordan. Which Greek composer began integrating traditional folk themes into his symphonies in the 1950s? Yannis Xenakis, Mikis Theodorakis, or Vangelis? And that would be Mikis Theodorakis. What was the title of the hit French movie in the 1950s that featured a memorable jazz score? The French movie with the memorable jazz score? That was Elevator to the Gallows. What style of music gained popularity in Spain during the 1950s alongside flamenco? Was it salsa? Was it tango? Or was it zarzuela? It was zarzuela. Which Scandinavian jazz musician was known for his pioneering work in piano during the 1950s? Niels Henning Ørsted Petersen, Jan Johansson, or Bent Hallberg? And that pioneering jazz musician was Jan Johansson. Which French artist became iconic for her cabaret performances in the 1950s? Dalida, France Gall, or Juliette Greco? And that French artist would be Juliette Greco. Which Polish composer wrote symphonies inspired by Polish folk songs in the 1950s? Polish composer wrote symphonies inspired by Polish folk songs. Witold Lutostowski. What was the name of the famous Norwegian jazz club that opened in the 1950s? Was it the Blue Note, Club 7, or the Cotton Club? And that Norwegian jazz club was Club 7. Which British composer was known for choral works premiered in the 1950s? William Walton, Edward Elgar, or Benjamin Britten? And that British composer was Benjamin Britten. What was the name of a famous 1950s French jazz festival? The Nice Jazz Festival, the Montreux Jazz Festival, or the Paris Jazz Festival? It was the Nice Jazz Festival. What did the 1950s skiffle movement in the UK inspire in the next decade? What did skiffle inspire? It inspired the British invasion. Which German orchestra gained international acclaim in the 1950s? The Berlin Philharmonic, the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra, or the Dresden Philharmonic? That would be the Berlin Philharmonic. What iconic French music venue hosted jazz performances in the 1950s? Moulin Rouge, Olympia, or Lido? And that French music venue was Olympia. Which Italian tenor gained fame in the 1950s for operatic performances? Mario Del Monaco, Luciano Pavarotti, or Giuseppe Di Stefano? That Italian tenor was Giuseppe Di Stefano in the 1950s. What style of jazz heavily influenced European musicians in the 1950s? Was it cool jazz? Was it bebop? Or was it swing? European musicians were heavily influenced by bebop. What was the focus of Hungarian composer Zoltán Kodály's work in the 1950s? The focus of his work was music education. Which style of traditional Finnish music saw a revival in the 1950s? Sami joik, kantele music, or Kalevala poetry? Traditional Finnish music. That would be Kalevala poetry. Which genre became a cultural phenomenon in the 1950s, led by artists like Elvis Presley? Rock and roll, rockabilly, or blues? And the genre that became a cultural phenomenon was rock and roll. Who is known as the king of rock and roll during the 1950s? Was it Elvis Presley? Was it Chuck Berry? Or was it Great Balls of Fire Jerry Lee Lewis? The king of rock and roll in the 50s. But of course, Elvis Presley. What was the title of Elvis Presley's first #1 single? Was it Blue Suede Shoes? Was it Heartbreak Hotel? Or was it Jailhouse Rock? Elvis's first #1 hit, Heartbreak Hotel. Which popular 1950s song by Buddy Holly was later used as a name for his band? Was it Every Day, Peggy Sue, or That'll Be the Day? And that would be That'll Be the Day. What female artist sang the 1953 hit Santa Baby in '53? And that artist would be Eartha Kitt. Which 1950s crooner became famous for songs like Mona Lisa and Unforgettable? Was it Nat King Cole? Was it Frank Sinatra? Or was it Dean Martin? Ooh, I can hear it in my ear now. Nat King Cole. What a pleasant earworm. Who is credited with creating the first rock and roll record, Rocket 88? Chuck Berry, Little Richard, or Ike Turner and his band? First rock and roll record, Rocket 88. That was Ike Turner and his band. Which legendary jazz musician released the influential album Kind of Blue in 1959? Duke Ellington, John Coltrane, or was it Miles Davis? In 1959. That was Miles Davis. What was the name of the vocal group that released Why Do Fools Fall in Love in 1956? And that vocal group was Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. Which 1950s hit begins with the lyrics, "You ain't nothing but a hound dog"? Shake, Rattle, and Roll, Hound Dog by Elvis Presley, or Rock Around the Clock? And that would be Hound Dog by Elvis Presley. What was the name of the influential rock and roll TV show hosted by Dick Clark? The Ed Sullivan Show, American Top 40, or American Bandstand? And that was American Bandstand. Which pioneering rock musician was known for his outrageous stage presence and songs like Tutti Frutti? Tutti Frutti. That was played by Little Richard. Which duo became famous for their song Wake Up Little Susie? Simon and Garfunkel, the Everly Brothers, or Peter and Gordon? And we are talking about the 50s. That was the Everly Brothers. What was the title of the first single to top the Billboard Hot 100 chart in 1958? At the top, Poor Little Fool by Ricky Nelson, or Volare? The first single that topped the Billboard 158, Poor Little Fool by Ricky Nelson. Who popularized the song Great Balls of Fire? Or perhaps, Goodness Gracious, Great Balls of Fire. That was Jerry Lee Lewis. What instrument did Chuck Berry make famous in rock music? Was it the guitar? Was it the saxophone? Or was it the piano? Chuck Berry made the guitar famous in rock and roll music. Which doo-wop group was known for their hit, Only You and You Alone? The Penguins, the Moonglows, or was it the Platters? It was the Platters. What style of dance was associated with rock and roll music in the 1950s? Style of dance. And that was the twist. Which 1950s singer had the nickname the Velvet Fog? Was it Perry Como? Was it Bobby Darin? Or was it Mel Torme? The Velvet Frog was Mel Torme. What was Elvis Presley's debut album called? Elvis Presley? Rock and Roll King? Or was it called Heartbreak Hotel? Elvis's debut album was titled Elvis Presley. Which singer released Chances Are, becoming a 1950s romantic ballad staple? Was it Johnny Mathis, Andy Williams, or was it Pat Boone? Chances Are, that's by Johnny Mathis. Which song by Chuck Berry was considered one of the first rock and roll anthems? And that song would be Johnny Be Good. Who is known as the First Lady of Rockabilly? Was that Patsy Cline? Was it Wanda Jackson? Or was it Brenda Lee? The First Lady of Rockabilly. That was Wanda Jackson. What was the name of the 1950s bandleader famous for his orchestra and hit song Sing Sing Sing? Was it Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, or Lawrence Welk? And that was Lawrence Welk. Who wrote and performed the hit La Bamba? Was it Elvis Presley? Was it Buddy Holly? Or was it Ritchie Valens? That would be Ritchie Valens. What is the name of the famous concert that marked the beginning of rock and roll? Which concert started it all? And that concert was the Moondog Coronation Ball. Which famous folk singer debuted during the late 1950s and later became a legend in the 1960s? Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, or was it Pete Seeger? And that would be Bob Dylan. Who was a 1950s singer nicknamed Mr. Excitement? Was it Sam Cooke, Jackie Wilson, or was it Ray Charles? And that 1950s singer was Jackie Wilson, Mr. Excitement. Which song by Bill Haley and his Comets is often credited as one of the first rock and roll hits? That song would be Rock Around the Clock. Which 1950s rock artist recorded the hit Blueberry Hill? Was it Chuck Berry? Was it Ray Charles? Or was it Fats Domino? It was Fats Domino, getting his thrills on Blueberry Hills. Which Australian singer became internationally famous for his country music hits in the 1950s? Was it Johnny O'Keefe? Was it Slim Dusty? Or was it Tex Morton? And that would be Slim Dusty. What was the title of Slim Dusty's iconic Australian song that was released in the 1950s? The Overlander Trail, Waltzing Matilda, or Pub with No Beer? And that was Pub with No Beer. Johnny O'Keefe was often referred to as the King of Australian rock and roll. Which of these was one of his biggest hits in the 1950s? Shout, Great Balls of Fire, or That'll Be the Day? That hit was Shout. Which type of music heavily influenced Australian popular music in the 1950s? Was it folk, was it rock and roll, or was it jazz? And that type of music was rock and roll. What was the name of the TV show in the late 1950s that helped introduce rock and roll to Australian audiences? And that TV show was 6 O'Clock Rock. Which American rock and roll artist's music had a major influence on the Australian music scene in the 1950s? Was it Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, or was it Buddy Holly? It was Elvis Presley. What was the first Australian rock and roll song to gain significant popularity? Shake, Rattle and Roll, Wild One by Johnny O'Keefe, or was it Rock Around the Clock? And that would be Wild One by Johnny O'Keefe. Who is known as the Queen of Yodeling in Australia during the 1950s? Was it Patsy Cline? Was it June Brownhill? Or was it Shirley Toms? Who was the Queen of Yodeling in Australia in the 50s? That would be Shirley Toms. Which city was considered the hub of rock and roll music in Australia during the 1950s? Was it Melbourne, Brisbane, or was it Sydney? The hub of rock and roll music in Australia was Sydney. And now question 100. What was the name of the Australian record label that played a crucial role in promoting local rock and roll artists in the 1950s? And that Australian record label was Festival Records. Thank you for playing Quiz Time. Drop your score in the comments, please. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss Quiz Time when it comes out. Because it comes out a lot, because it's fun, and we like playing Quiz Time with you. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.